welcome to Friday Afternoon Live. Take a look around you. Go around left and right. You see some new faces in the audience. They're not necessarily new faces, they're kind of old faces. But they are guests here today, special guests, because for the current inmates of the school, they are you in a few years' time. That's not some kind of creepy time travel thing. That's basically, these are alumni. They graduated successfully, paid off their parking fines. They're out in the world doing very well. And today, a number of them come back. They've been with us in the school today. A number of them are dotted around here. And they've come to celebrate being alumni of this program. This year is our 45th anniversary. It's kind of an odd anniversary. It's 45 years. And it takes us back to the year of 1969, which the majority of you will not remember except for some historical fact. Some of you will remember it in kind of a haze. But it was a very interesting year politically and socially. It was the first year that humankind walked on the moon, for example. It was the first year that a group of people, quite possibly some of your parents, went out to the East Coast for a small music festival called Woodstock and rolled in the mud and changed musical cultural history. It was a year that a group of English university graduates got together and thought they were funny and really changed the way we think about humor, called Monty Python's Flying Circus. It certainly perverted my entire generation of context, and it's done a pretty good job on subsequent groups since. Since that time, some of those grads are here today from the very early 70s. The school has, I hope, grown and flourished to the point where there are now 4,500 alumni in 35 countries, in every state of the United States, and many of them obviously around here. They're doing very well. They're in architecture, they're in planning, they're in all of the associated fields involved in the physical environment. They are loyal to a fault to this program. They provide you with scholarships, they provide externships, internships, they provide jobs. They're worth getting to know. They're a good group. And if nothing more, they are great role models. And when I say role models, I talk to us. This is a warning for our speakers tonight, to behave, basically. We've had a day of interesting activities with our alumni here, and we're culminating here in a lecture with two of our most distinguished alums who hit the architectural scene in a big way internationally since they graduated in the mid-90s. And you know them. You know Brian and Sebastian. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about them because they are exemplars of this program. They've won over 75 design awards, many of them national, international, since 2004. Their work is everywhere. They are published extraordinarily broadly across the country, across the world. Their work has appeared in, I think, about 15 to 20 different countries. The kind of adjectives that people use about their work when you look through very many books, and newspapers and blogs that they're in: most innovative, sustainable, best, and I like this one, fabulous. Most recently, they're part of a multidisciplinary design team that has been finalized as one of the 4 finalists for the Lakefront competition here in town. So you will see them strutting their stuff pretty soon. But their work is wonderful. They're professors of practice here in the school. They teach great studios. We are delighted they're here. We hope you have a chance to meet them and the other alums in the audience. Later this evening, we have a reception out in the main space. But for now, let's hear a big round of applause for Johnsen Schmaling.
I don't have a microphone, so I hope I can speak loud enough so you can hear me. Yeah? Just yell if you can't. Thanks, Bob, for the introduction. And oh, yeah, can I? Yes. By the way, I'm Sebastian Schmaling. Brian Johnsen is sitting here in the front row, giving me the clues what to do. All right, so since this whole day is about commemorating the evolution of the architecture school from its humble beginnings to the sort of established institution that it is today, I thought I would start with a quick look at the early days of our own office, which we founded in 2003, actually exactly 12 years ago. It was March 1st that we started. We set up shop in the attic of our friend and fellow alumnus, Adam Pearson, who some of you may know. And he owned a house in Brewers Hill, and the attic is here shown in this picture. Some of you may still remember Whitney Gould, who was the prolific architectural critic at the journal Sentinel and who wrote a column about design every Monday, which was sort of religiously read by the design community here in Milwaukee. And Whitney Gould was gracious enough to introduce us to her readers. And actually, I think we have to thank Jim Shields here, Professor Shields in the front row. He told her about our new venture, and that triggered sort of a phone call and this article. So this happened the week after we had officially opened our business, and the journal ran this story about us, you know, young guys starting a new design studio in an attic, and in fact it was through this very article that we got our first 2 commissions. And you can imagine the pride, you know, seeing this big picture of our office space in the attic in the newspaper. But of course, it was that same image that triggered a chain of unfortunate events that almost did us in before we could get fully operational. What happened was that somebody, and we have our suspicions who that somebody was, saw the picture and contacted the city and complained about us operating a business out of a home on 2nd Street. And it turned out that was totally illegal, of course, and against all zoning rules, as well as all the electrical wiring that we had done after hours without pulling the proper permits. So really great start for young architects to prove their acumen. And the inspector who showed up to survey the crime scene was not amused, and a few days later we received an official eviction notice that forced us to abandon the attic immediately and find a new space for our studio. And that was all barely 2 weeks after we had started.
Glad I could help.
Yeah. Thank you. So that was not a good beginning, as you can imagine. And within a week, we had moved all our stuff to a raw space that we luckily found in the 3rd ward. That was when the 3rd ward was still affordable for people like us, you know, before it got sort of super gentrified and Starbucked up. And we stayed up in this space for about 2.5 or 3 years before moving to our current office on Brady Street, where we have been ever since. You know, it's this great brick building that used to be a Schlitz Tavern, one of many here in Milwaukee, sort of these corner taverns you can find everywhere. And our favorite part of the building is that mosaic, you know, circled in orange, which advertises Schlitz, you know, the beer that made Milwaukee famous. So we like that. This blatant and irresponsible encouragement to use alcohol of course makes sort of an awkward transition to the theme of the actual lecture this afternoon, which is entitled Staying Sober. So let me explain and start with a few general comments about the cultural climate in which we as architects operate today before showing you some of our actual work. And I was hoping to have a pointer here, which doesn't exist in the school. Bob, 45 years. Sobriety sucks. This seems to be a prevailing attitude today, and I'm of course not talking about abstinence from alcohol or drugs, but about the idea of aesthetic sobriety. You know, the concept of a sober, disciplined approach to architecture, which seems to be more and more dismissed as timid and boring. And I think it's fair to say that our profession is increasingly going sort of topsy-turvy in an attempt to stay relevant and to get attention in a world with a short attention span and a voracious appetite for constant entertainment. And I think it's this need for attention that is the driving force behind a sort of troublesome new formalism that has taken hold of today's architecture, and which Brian and I find very uninteresting. It's a formalism that is based on complex algorithms and enabled by a rapidly evolving set of parametric design tools. And it's a formalism that is almost baroque in its addiction to sculptural fireworks. I don't want to come across as some sort of Luddite pontificating against technological progress, and our office uses technology just like every other office, I suppose. But I think we find it troublesome when form is generated simply because it's mathematically possible, or simply because it promises an aesthetic spectacle, you know, a spectacle that, of course, more often than not serves no other purpose than to give some well-capitalized corporation a branding opportunity. And that is problematic for architecture in general. You know, the tragedy for architecture is that our audience is becoming increasingly numb to the subtle qualities of the built environment in general and architecture in particular. And so they need ever more powerful stimulants, it seems, to stay awake and interested, which explains today's sort of bizarre and sometimes amusing game of professional one-upmanship among architects who are constantly trying to outdo each other. We have now come to the point at which the right angle is increasingly viewed as prosaic or even reactionary, which is sort of interesting because, you know, think about it, right, beyond any aesthetic preferences or beyond the fact that we now have the tools to create any shape with a click of a mouse, there really is no good reason to flat out dismiss the orthogonal or perpendicular as a thing of the past, right? We live in a Cartesian world and probably will continue to do so for the time being, if we can survive. And despite of what some people are trying to tell us, things are still easier to make and easier to fabricate and easier to assemble when they are straight and when they are modular than when they are not. And that's, I think, a lesson that needs to be taught in school today as much as it has been in the past. Things are possible but not easy. And, you know, this is obviously a pretty sophomoric analogy, but there is a reason why chocolate bars continue to be gridded, you know, rather than sort of deformed. I think part of what is getting lost in this current dynamic is our ability to hold on to the concept of restraint and simplicity as sort of fundamental architectural virtues. We are losing our ability to make do with what is at our direct disposal and within our reach, you know, like dimensional lumber or concrete block or standard steel sections, and then to transform these simple things into relevant architecture that transcends the inherent utilitarian nature of these materials. And so restraint plays a key role in the design process of our office. Brian and I think that restraint is our willingness as architects to approach context again with a sense of, you know, humility. It's our ability to step back and to listen respectfully to what exists and to embrace the idea that a building doesn't have to be flamboyant or outrageous or loud in order to be relevant architecture. And I believe it's that willingness to listen which ultimately allows a building to connect to the landscape so that it evolves out of it rather than just sitting on it as a self-referential object. And I suppose this is what we are trying to do in our work. So let me jump into a handful of projects that I hope will illustrate our attitude. The Camouflage house was completed about at least 7 years ago, right, Brian? 7 years ago. So it's been a while, but I think it's still a good example of how we approach context and try to transform it into a palette of architectural operations that inform the design of the building. The site for this project is a heavily wooded, narrow sliver of land on a steep bluff overlooking Green Lake, which is about 2.5 hours, 3 hours up north here from Milwaukee. Our early conceptual studies focused on the colors and textures of the surrounding woods, starting with the verticality of the trees. One of the conceptual models that we made was this shadow box here in this slide, where we explored the rhythmic shifts between tree trunks as you move through the forest. Captured here in a series of photographs where we illuminated the model from behind. And you can kind of see how the foreground shifts against the background. It was something that we found sort of fascinating. It's something we tried to capture in this building. And at the same time, we looked at the ever-changing foliage ever-changing color of the foliage, shown here in this conceptual diagram where we pixelate an image of context at decreasing resolutions to transform it into a sort of compositional template for the building skin itself. And here in this conceptual facade model, for which we used leaves collected at the site, with the idea to come up with a cladding system that would create a sort of camouflage-like veil, echoing the colors and the hues of the site. These studies informed the overall organization of the building skin as a series of solids and voids. The image here shows the simple bar building as you approach it from the plateau, so the bluff starts dropping off behind the building. And you can see these floor-to-ceiling windows alternating with the more solid walls, and these glimpses that these windows allow or open up through the house into the landscape beyond. The building is wrapped in a base layer of untreated cedar, which forms the backdrop for a series of pre-finished epoxy core wood veneer panels that were stained at different colors. The size and spacing of the panels overlaps with the structural rhythm of the exposed columns. You can kind of see this here vaguely, these brown vertical lines. And that compositionally adds to a sense of controlled randomness to the composition. The house is a simple bar building nestled into the hill. In plan, you enter the house from this clearing here. There's a detached garage that is connected with an open breezeway to a glass foyer that pierces through that main bar and then terminates into this balcony overlooking the bluff. And then the main level itself, where you enter, is an open living hall with kitchen, dining, living spaces. And that open space can extend into that top portion of the bar, which is a screen room separated by the living hall with a retractable glass door. So in the summer, you can just open it up and basically extend the living space into that space. And then you go down the stairs into a partially submerged lower level. It's open to this side, and then this is a long retaining wall. There are bedrooms and a family room, and then access to the bluff itself. This axon here shows the main building components, including the various layers that make up the facade system. You can see here it's a simple post and beam structure that sits on a concrete shelf that forms a retaining wall. That's the concrete shelf, the retaining wall cut into the hill. And in the model, it shows the relationship, sort of the sectional relationship between the bluff side and the clearing, the higher portion of the building where you enter the building. This is a view from the bluff, toward the house now appearing as a two-story building with the exposed lower level. And this is a detailed shot of the layered facade system. The cedar has started to weather to a silver gray, not unlike the tree trunks of the surrounding landscape. And then the veneer panels are designed to keep their original color. So there's this sort of, that juxtaposition of a man-made or a treated lumber product, that reads against that more naturally weathering backdrop. The main level of the house is clad in clear sealed MDF panels, held apart by reveals that mark the structural grid of the house. You can kind of see that here, aligning with the beams above. The concrete retaining wall that we saw, that's from that concrete shelf that I showed in the image before. We added wood boards to the formwork, which included wider boards that again pick up the structural lines of the house, and then smaller or more narrow boards sort of randomly spaced in between. And then we pulled the boards off the concrete formwork slightly before it was fully cured to achieve a sort of rugged surface, and then filled some of the reveals with new milled wood boards to increase that haptic quality of the wall, because that's the wall that you walk by as you enter or go into your bedrooms on the lower level. This is a view of the main level, main living and dining space, and you see the view out into that screen room beyond that glass, the folding glass door here, and an image in the screen room overlooking the lake. And in the summer, the open screen room really serves as the lung of the house, if you will. capturing the lake breeze and bringing fresh air deep into the house, which makes mechanical conditioning virtually unnecessary. And here we are in the bedroom below the screen room, and you can see the textured concrete wall as it sort of extends beyond the enclosure of the house and it terminates into the rock outcropping outside, which creates a little sort of intimate grotto terrace that is accessible from this bedroom. And here we are basically standing behind that rock outcropping we saw in the previous picture, and we see a little bit of the bedroom and the screen porch above, and an evening view back at the building from the clearing. The second project I want to show today is the Toppo house, which we completed last summer. And we worked on that project probably for 3 years before it got completed. We approached the issue of contextuality very similar to the previous project, but while the Camouflage house, in a sense, is based on the abstracted projection of context onto the building volume, this project here develops its three-dimensional form out of the site's distinct topography. The site is located in Wisconsin's driftless region, which is an unglaciated area west of Madison, an area that wasn't actually covered by the glaciers from Canada. So that it's a sort of an area with softly rolling hills, that alternate with tight ravines. And one of our first context models interpreted this distinct topography and the experience of moving through this landscape in a series of parallel folding planes. You can see that here on the right. And this was followed by several generations of study models in which we transformed that first abstract concept study into a more tangible building form until we inserted program elements and arrived at two staggered parallel bars that form a low-slung volume with a roof plane that extends the grade over parts of the house and then slowly peels itself up from the ground. The series of diagrams here at the bottom show the evolution, the formal evolution of the building. We divided the program up into 4 separate volumes that we started shifting vertically against one another, following the topography of the site, and then we pulled out of the volumes out of the overall form of the building, these yellow volumes that became outdoor rooms that provide protection from the strong winds that are constantly shifting in this area, and sort of provide protected areas that can be, are accessible from the inside. The volumes and courtyards are then unified by this gently rising copper roof ribbon that you see in the axon, that brown element, folding up from the ground plane and terminates in a dramatic cantilever. And then you see the green roof that sort of laps the vegetation from the side over the lower portion of the building and sort of ties those two elements together. This is a view of the building as you approach it from the southeast, and you can see how the form of the building, sort of rises out of the ground. View from the other side. By the way, all these images are slightly stretched so that they look longer and sort of flatter than the building actually is. The plans here show the relationship of enclosed and open spaces with a central spine that sort of connects them. The diagrams here at the bottom is basically a Noli plan of our project here. And you can see sort of like this ambiguous footprint that the house has, which subverts the boundaries between what's inside and what's outside. And then the last diagram here in the right-hand corner is it shows the different floor plates, in different shades of grays, 50 grades of shades. Changing elevations in relation to one another. I talked about these sort of floor plates that rise up along with the topography of the place where we positioned the house. With the light gray showing the lowest elevation, and then the dark gray, the part of the building that is at the highest point. And the section model here at the top sort of shows a little bit these, that internal topography that these shifting floor plans create as they follow the site topography with this observatory at the very top. And then at the bottom, we are looking at the edge of the roof plane. You can see that copper line that basically is continuous and slowly rises up over the lower part of the building, then folding back before it cantilevers over the edge of the house. This is a view standing on the lower green roof looking south, and you can see where it turns into that folding copper roof plane, as it slopes up in the back of the observatory. And this is a view of the entry courtyard carved into the building volume, and you will notice how the roof plane is opened up, but the perimeter of the roof is continuous. And that was very important to us because we wanted to maintain the continuation of this roof ribbon. So when you look at the house from the side, you will see a continuous line even though there is an opening behind it. Again, the courtyard, obviously standing here on the ground level, and the large glass door, glass panel here on the left is a pivot door that leads you into a little entry gallery in the center of the house. Here we're in the kitchen. That's sort of a few steps up. You can kind of see how that steps down in the back there. And then when you turn around, you can see into the living room beyond with stairs penetrating the ceiling plane and then leading up into that observatory above. And the living room then opens up to a south-facing patio that is protected by the long roof cantilever. The material palette of the building is basically limited to cast-in-place concrete, copper, and integrally colored fiber concrete panels, all materials that are extremely durable and can weather and age gracefully. The other important facade element you can see here are these vertical fins that sort of separate these dark colored panels from one another. One of the things that we noticed on our visits were the sort of dramatic surface deformations that occur when wind blows over the crops and grasses of the surrounding fields. What at one moment looks like a perfectly level and smooth horizontal plane suddenly gets warped and distorted when the wind touches it, shown here on the left in this picture here, in the green picture. We wanted to capture this sort of surface deformation in the facade with a series of vertical facade fins of interrelated, expanding, and contracting shapes, shown here in a series of study models. And we ended up with 190 individually shaped aluminum fins cut by a water jet. You can see here one of the fabricators sort of taking measurements, and then these were shipped to the anodizer to make them black. And then here installed, you can kind of see that distorting visual effect that these fins create. So the appearance of the house constantly changes depending on the angle from which you approach it, and of course the time of the day, and the shadows that these fins cast onto the building skin itself. And we sort of like how the fins sort of subvert and almost destabilize the geometric purity of the building volume itself. The next project, the Redaction house, is interesting because context here was much less accommodating than the sort of bucolic and pristine settings of the two previous examples. The building sits on a tight sliver of land on a small lake in the Delafield area, west of Milwaukee, and is really part of a necklace of sort of prosaic suburban spec homes that crowd the shoreline. The site offered one small view corridor of the lake, but as you looked sideways or turned around, you would be confronted with the sort of prototypical and uninspired built-up context of suburbia. Not really a source for inspiration, right? And so in a way, this project became an exercise in context avoidance, if you will, and it compelled us to design an introvert building that could easily, but basically function as an optic filter that would frame the views that are desirable and then edit out those that were not. The idea of introversion affected the formal evolution of the house, which is based on a series of simple volumetric reductions here shown in the top row, and then subsequent volumetric additions shown at the bottom, which led to a sort of fragmented cube with spatial voids that organized the program inside. We basically ended up with a brick podium that is carved into the hill and interlocks with a wood cube above. And we are looking here at the side of the brick podium, which extends to the street and then turns into a perforated garden wall with a small entry courtyard behind. This is a view from the street, and you can see that brick podium in the foreground, which on the right side becomes the garage with a green roof, and on the left it opens up, into that entry courtyard space, and it's right at that threshold where the process of editing out context starts. The courtyard leads to a transparent front door that again is sort of framing a view of the lake beyond. And in the courtyard, you are basically in a transitional space that takes you from the suburban reality on the outside into an aesthetically controlled realm. The openings in the brick wall here on the left decrease in size as you walk toward the door. So you're gradually basically losing visual contact with the neighboring homes. And a view back, and you can see again the opening pattern in the brick wall sort of decreasing to zero to become a solid wall here right next to the entrance. So the process of visual redaction continues inside. As I mentioned, the site is tightly sandwiched between two houses, which makes it rather difficult to enjoy the narrow view of the lake given the sort of overwhelming and unavoidable presence of these neighboring houses. And when we were looking at possible strategies for how to edit this difficult visual panorama, one thing that came to mind was how classified documents get censored, like when the CIA or the NSA redact problematic portions of a text while leaving the inoffensive parts legible. So for us, this meant conceptually to take the existing context and censor everything we wouldn't want to see. This conceptual graphic here became the starting point for a series of study models of the building envelope itself, which helped us to explore which arrangements of walls and windows would harvest the most unimpeded views and ultimately what they would do compositionally to the exterior. This is what you see when you step from the entry door through the front door into the building. Basically an open space with kitchen and dining, and then a two-story sitting room beyond. You can see the staggered apertures in the back. Here we're looking into that space, into that double height space from the upper level. And you can see the interplay of solid walls and those large apertures that frame views into the landscape while blocking out others. The house was designed for a fiber artist and her family of 5, and in this picture you may notice those narrow colored strips here in the facade. When we first met with the owner about designing our house, we were really sort of taken by her collection of textiles and all sorts of colorful yarn and strings in her studio, and we wanted to integrate that idea into the facade of the building as a sort of subtle nod at what she does and at the colors that make up her work. In a close-up view, you can see how these strips, they're just painted wood boards, sort of selected from the adjacent wood boards of the facade. You can see how these strips almost seem to weave through the facade like narrow threads. The Pleated house was completed last fall. It's a small building for a couple who moved back to Door County after spending the last few decades in Boston. Our site is a hilly parcel of land in the woods along Door County's eastern shoreline, just south of Whitefish Dunes State Park, if anybody knows the area. The house is a low and sort of dark and somber volume that sits in a small clearing that you reach from a gravel drive. And this is basically how the building appears as you drive up to it. And as you move around the house, you can see how it sort of quietly sits nestled in the clearing and really seems to be embedded in the vegetation surrounding it. One thing that really sparked our interest in this project sort of happened when we started working, walking the site and looking around, and we started looking more closely at bark. When you look at the tree trunk from afar, it usually looks just like a simple cylindrical extrusion of its diameter, but when you zoom in, you realize the sort of complexity and visual depth that bark has. And it's a highly textured and undulating skin, almost like a pleated curtain, if you will, sort of wrapping the trunk. And it creates a dense, animated surface of valleys and peaks that cast deep shadows onto itself. And we were trying to think how to sort of capture and emulate this effect in the architecture of the building itself. And we started with a piece of bark and mapped its folding surface, which resulted in a sort of random but beautiful line that oscillates between the outermost points of the bark, and then these deep recesses in between. This figure became the conceptual template for our investigations into a building skin that would adopt a similar texture. What we were interested in, and this is something that I believe runs through all of our work as a common thread, was a way to achieve a more ambiguous building perimeter that would sort of soften the usually abrupt transition from nature to wall, or from inside to outside. You sort of thicken up that condition between those two extremes. What you see here at the top is a plan view of a conventional facade system. So the black lines show the four corners of a typical building volume, and then the orange line is a planar projection of all four sides of a conventional building, shown as a continuous band, right? So there's just one line. And then the diagram at the bottom is an actual plan view of the facade system that we designed for the Pleated house. You can see how the slightly angled facade planes create a sort of meandering veil. So this is a close-up shot of this pleated veil, which wraps around the house as a gently folding plane of charred cedar boards. The boards were installed as a rain screen over furring strips of varying dimensions, which allowed us to achieve, that sort of undulation that we were looking for. And then the changing angles of the walls capture the light very differently, which we find interesting because it's all the same material, but you can kind of see that modulation of gray tones that happens just because of how the different angles reflect the light. And they add a level of depth to the facade that really defies the very conventional 2x6 construction behind it. The main living functions and the small studio space are located on the main level, which is the drawing here to the left. And then there's a small sort of bedroom volume that sits on top, surrounded by a green roof covering the building. We emphasize the entrance by carving deep into the building volume to create a small forecourt. That's this area here. And so that small forecourt leads to an entry door and then sort of draws views into and through the building. This is a view of that entry condition, and it's here where the charred cedar wrapper folds away from the main elevation of the house, sort of folding into that court. And on the other side, you can see where the black veil simply stops and then exposes a highly articulated wall of milled and varnished cedar blocks, which we stacked at slightly tighter angles to echo the undulation of the charred wrapper, but at smaller intervals or tighter intervals. And then this cedar wall leads into the entry vestibule and then pierces through the volume and then reappears on the outside here. It is in a sort of covered outdoor room, which is basically on the opposite side of that entry courtyard that we saw. And then that room opens up into a long linear patio along the edge of the woods. Here we are on the patio. And a view back at the house in the evening with a 23-foot wide lift slide glass door along the living hall. This is in the living hall, with that large lift slide door in the back, flooding the space with light and visually connecting the inside to the land outside. The other side of the living room is anchored by this delicate white lacquered steel staircase that leads upstairs into the bedroom. You can kind of see that here. And a view from the stairs back into the kitchen space next to it. And here you can see that upper level bedroom volume, which sits on top of the charred cedar base and is surrounded by the green roof of the house. One of our smallest and most simple projects probably has been this studio for a country western musician. The building consists of three main elements: a concrete base, an open volume for the studio, and a steel shroud. The concrete podium was carved into the hill. I'm talking here about that diagram to the left. That concrete podium was carved into the hill, and it provides storage space for equipment, and also serves obviously as the base supporting the linear studio volume above. The long sides of that volume are covered by the weathering steel shroud, which is slightly lifted off the concrete plinth to reveal a narrow clear story below. With this clear story, we allowed the studio volume to seemingly float above its base, but also to provide natural light into the storage space below, and also to emit a sort of ominous glow into the landscape at night. The plan view of the studio, very simple rectangular space with large glazed openings on either end, here to enter into the studio, and here to go onto the green roof of the concrete plinth. View into and through the tubular space of the studio, and it's just an austere, empty space for the owner to contemplate, compose his music, relax, and practice. For the steel shroud, we purposefully kept all the alloy imperfections, surface oils, and roller marks from the steel mill untreated, to create a sort of unpredictable and ever-changing veneer that would contrast with the formal rigor of the building itself. The thing about this project is that it's utilitarian and it's raw, and it is very clear about what it does, and in that sense we think that it continues quite faithfully the tradition of Midwestern pastoral architecture and its sort of legacy of aesthetic simplicity and robust craftsmanship. And I think this is why the building sort of looks like it belongs to the site, almost like it's always been there. This next project was designed as a small getaway for a young family from Chicago. Just like the studio, it occupies a site in the woods in central Wisconsin. The building sits at the end of an old logging road and hugs the sloped edge of a small clearing deep inside the woods. We called this project Stacked Cabin because we arrived at the form of the building by taking the horizontally organized components of a traditional cabin compound, sort of a generic photo of it you see in the lower left corner. Those compounds usually consist of an open longhouse, a communal living space, and an outhouse and a freestanding tool shed. And we were taking those components and stacked them vertically, which allowed us to minimize the footprint of the building on the sort of pristine side, and then take advantage, of course, of the slope of the side and the views into the treetops that a higher elevation would offer. The lowest level of the cabin houses a workshop and a washroom and the building infrastructure. And you enter the building through this door here, and there are stairs right behind that lead up to an open living hall above. That living hall is centered around a stove and bracketed by a simple galley kitchen on one side and a pair of small open sleeping rooms on the other. And you can see those floor-to-ceiling curtains on either side of that living space, which can be arranged to provide privacy for the bedrooms or visually screen the kitchen when it's not in use. And then at the top of the cabin, we stacked what was originally conceived as another space adjacent to the living room to create a more intimate and sort of elevated observatory with, obviously pretty spectacular views into the treetops and beyond, in a place that can function as an overflow bedroom for guests, or just a way to get away from the action of the kids on the main level. Okay, so the projects I've shown so far have all been pretty much small scale and mostly residential, which is a pretty honest representation and sort of a cross-section of the types of commissions that we have worked on over the first decade of our studio's existence. But there has been a bit of a shift in the last 2 years, and we have started to work on some bigger and more commercial projects, and I wanted to show you 2 projects that are both slated for construction this spring and that are marking a little bit that jump in scale for us. The first one is a new building for an art gallery and studio in downtown Racine. Racine, as you all know, is about 30 miles south from here, and the city is of course most famous for the Johnsen wax campus by Frank Lloyd Wright. By the way, this tower is now open again for visitors. It's pretty spectacular. They renovated it quite handsomely. And then it's famous too for the infamous crash of an Oscar Mayer Wienermobile into a house a few years ago, which made national headlines. It was on CNN, so it must be true. And then a few blocks south of that accident, we designed a house for a young family back in 2008, which we called the OS House, and which was one of the first LEED Platinum homes here in the Midwest. This is a view from the street, and then a view back, and the building was wrapped in this really thick, 8-inch deep rain screen facade system, which at the corners dissolves into this sort of delicate scrim of aluminum rods, which you can see in this picture. In any case, I'm not going to talk about this project anymore, but the new art gallery and art studio building will sit on a site located a bit further up north in the downtown area of Racine. It's a long and narrow lot at the end of an urban block on the western border of downtown, and the building will sit next to this party wall that you can see here. One of the things that gave the street corner a sort of iconic and recognizable presence was the old signage that you see here at the right bottom corner of the party wall, which appeared a few years ago after an old one-story CMU storage building that was sitting there was torn down. And we decided that the signage was something that we wanted to try to preserve. What's interesting about our site is that it's located right where 2 major street grids in Racine collide, one gridding the city at a slightly different angle than the other. And where they collide, they create a sort of row of trapezoid or rhombus-shaped blocks. This graphic here, by the way, was a representation of the ambition of the owner to create a cultural anchor at the western side of downtown. It sort of brackets downtown with the Racine Art Museum, pretty handsome building by Brendan Stool and Lynch from Chicago. It's probably 10 years old, but probably one of the nicer buildings of contemporary architecture in Racine since the demise of Frank Lloyd Wright, of course. In the drawing here on the left, our block is the orange field, and you can see the geometric collision that happens right here. It creates one of those interesting urban conditions that we all know from older American cities where buildings have to accommodate the skewed boundaries resulting from these kind of grid overlaps, that are results from surveying mistakes or just sort of property disputes when these cities were laid out and founded. A typical example of that sort of condition is the Flatiron building in New York, but we are obviously working in a slightly different scale. But so what we wanted to do is capture and express that geometric tension of the site and the building form itself. So we started with a rectangular shape of the property and then carved out small spaces next to the existing party wall to create a pronounced spatial reveal between the old building and the new. And then we started to manipulate the building mass on the upper level so that it gradually peels away from the first floor and then cantilevers over the sidewalk. And, you can see here this really rough conceptual model, and it gives you an idea of how this evolution is shaping the proposed building volume. The glazing in front of the ground floor gallery, or enclosing the ground floor gallery, opens views through the building and then frames the view of that old signage behind. You can kind of see that sneaking through there, right? The studio volume above is wrapped in a curtain wall with transparent and translucent glazing and tightly spaced, very deep vertical louvers to create a sort of robust and deep and rhythmic facade that reads against the smooth articulation of the gallery base below. And then the other project that is scheduled to start construction this spring is a mixed-use building for an indoor rock climbing gym and 54 apartment units here in Milwaukee, which we are designing for the Mendel Group, which you all know as one of the leading and certainly one of the architecturally most ambitious developers here in the city. Our building will occupy a vacant parcel next to the large Pick and Save development on the corner of Humboldt and North. You can see that here in that aerial view to the left. It's a few blocks really north of our office on Brady Street. The site is part of an old brownfield site that used to be occupied by the rail yards and shops of the Milwaukee Road Rail Company. Trains were basically going down what is known today as these condos of the Beer Line, and then terminated in the yards in the area where our site is located. This photo here is from the late 60s, and the orange area there is roughly where our building will sit. That's another view just before the yards closed. You can see Humboldt here as the street where this one car is driving through, and then this pretty nice view of downtown sort of lurking in the back. The somewhat anti-intuitive idea of merging contrasting images of Rust Belt decay and mountain scenery was quite intriguing to us. It's that inherent tension that we were trying to make visible and exploit in the design. The building breaks down into a 50-foot-tall long-span structure for the rock climbing gym, and then an L-shaped housing component that wraps around two sides of that gym. The two elements are then tied together with a corten steel facade bracket, if you will. It's shown here as this U-shaped piece. One of the challenges was how to address an urban street corner with a program that essentially requires a windowless big box, not unlike many warehouses or manufacturing buildings in the suburbs, and not unlike the facility that Adventure Rock, that's the operator for that rock climbing gym, is in right now in Brookfield. But by shifting the gym volume slightly beyond the housing complex, we created a vertical window wall that turns into a clear story at the top and allows for glimpses into the building from the street. So it becomes the marker of the building and the signage of the building. Maybe more important was the treatment of the blank wall that you see here to the left. That's the wall facing North Avenue, which required to have no windows and no penetrations in it. So we wanted to turn that into a sort of highly animated and tactile, textured canvas that would read almost as an abstraction of the sort of rugged climbing surfaces that you can find inside the gym. I started the design process with this napkin sketch here, something I think that happened in a bar, if I remember correctly. Brian, can you refresh my memory? You know, the idea of using some material that somehow could be randomly folded to create that sort of highly textured facade. We were first thinking of cast-in-place concrete panels with sort of different types of form liners, and of course it became very clear very quickly that the tight budget of the project required a much more conventional approach. So we experienced with different ways to install, you know, various layers of off-the-shelf sheet good in ways that would achieve the effect that we were looking for. So here you can see the final model of the building with a rock climbing gym interlocking with a housing block and then creating this long clear story around the top that allows rock climbers inside to see the city skyline, you know, if they are skilled to climb all the way up to the top. Oh, action. And then finally, let me finish with a project about beer. After all, we live in Milwaukee, right? And beer is part of our DNA. We were asked in 2006, I believe, to reimagine the public spaces in the former Blatz Brewery downtown, which consists of a series of beautiful, interconnected masonry buildings that are on the National Register of Historic Places. And after the brewery had closed in the early 1980s, it was converted very cheaply and ill-conceived into offices and apartments. The key intervention for us was the design of a series of rotating bottle doors that sit between the lower part of the two-story entry lobby and a public lounge adjacent to it. The doors are almost 9-foot square aluminum frames, powder-coated, and then each with 1,600 empty beer bottles suspended in a web of CNC precision-milled neoprene rings. You can kind of see these shimmering through. The doors can be rotated so that they close off the adjacent lounge when there's like some private function, or open up that space as an expansion of the lobby into it, depending obviously on the use of the lounge. And then we found 400 bottles in the basement of the brewery, which apparently had never been cleaned out after the brewery had closed back in the early 80s. And the remaining 6,000 bottles were purchased from the same local factory that made the original bottles. Is still in business, still has the dies, or what you would call them, for those bottles. You know, that was obviously important because these neoprene rings had to be fitted for for a consistent size of bottle, so we couldn't just use bottles of a different dimension. This is probably one of the more interesting drawings that we have produced over the years. It shows the corner of the door frame and then a custom pivot mechanism that supports it. The frames were shop fabricated. Here on the left you can see the CNC milled neoprene web being installed into the frame at the shop, and then the bottles being inserted into the web on the side. And depending on the position of the panels, they turn into backlit screens, you know, for the lobby, or function as a sort of amber-colored lenses that bring light into that into the lounge. Excuse me. So this final image here is perhaps the perfect segue into the next portion of this evening. I hear they serve alcohol, so it seems promising. Thank you very much, and be happy to take questions if there's time. It depends. I mean, we have been asked to sort of evaluate sites But most often people really have a piece of property, and we're sort of open to almost anything, you know, because like every site has something that is intriguing or interesting for us to explore. So, you know, if you look at something like that suburban site, it's probably a site we would not have chosen for somebody, but it's something that creates a thought process that then, you know, turns into some interesting architecture. Yes, sir.
So you all have very modest designs and staying sober in your palette, but the firm that you're working for, working with for the lakefront project, their landscape designs are very playful and kind of, I mean, they're sort of almost showy in the way that you kind of were against. And I'm interested to sort of know about your relationship and possibly previews for what's to come.
There honestly is no preview because it hasn't started yet. You know, it's one of those things we actually don't know exactly how that collaboration works. We certainly didn't pick that firm. You know, they sort of approached us, and we'll see. You know.
It seems like you spend a good amount of time sort of investigating the site at first and see kind of the things that the site has to offer. Would you say that makes up a big part of your design process, and given some of these designs you have and how they're really relative to some of the elements on the site?
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
that kind of a focus of your firm that you really try to?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think context is interesting for us. You know, not context in a literal sense that we. You know, I think context has been so commodified in the way we talk about it today. You know, I think there's no project ever built today by some sleazy developer that is not claiming to be contextual in one way or another. That's not the kind of context we are interested in. You know, I think it's more trying to distill something from the site that sort of captures the idiosyncrasies of the site. You know, contextual in urban context where you say you make a brick building because the next one, you know, the existing one next door is brick. That's sort of banal and not interesting to us, and we don't think that has anything to do with contextuality. So I think, yeah, it is a focal point in our design process, and I think it's also something that just keeps us interested in what we are doing. You know, that we sort of create our own problems and set of parameters, you know, that inform the way we actually develop a project. I think, you know, the other thing too is I think there's something philosophical about it. The idea of trying to create buildings that sort of sit in the back, in the back, you know, like to sort of disappear almost. And I think that's something you see throughout our work. That you know, there's something weird about building in nature, right? And it's something that we don't necessarily choose. You know, this is part of our job. You know, people want to build buildings there, and we are certainly not preventing them from not doing it. But I think what we're trying to do is to create buildings that sort of seem they fit there. You know, that they sort of disappear almost in the surroundings, not in a literal way, but in a sort of in by abstracting the surroundings, it's sort of projecting it onto the building, or sort of working what we derive from the context and working that into the design. Yeah,
it seems like you're really activating certain elements that are otherwise kind of overlooked.
Right, and that's sort of like, I think, what we're trying to do, and certainly what challenges us every day and keeps us sort of on our toes.
You two have gotten a chance to work on a lot of ideas, clearly, in the 10 years or so since you had your own firm. What do you two dream about?
What?
Each other.
What did he? I didn't hear the last part of the question.
I wasn't digging your secrets. With much of your architecture career still ahead of you, what did the two of you dream about?
Yeah, John. I think Brian answered it just right. No.
What do you consider conceive of in the future that you'd love to explore? Like, are there some things that just you don't have to come up yet, but you'd like to, maybe?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think there's a whole series of sort of building programs and typologies you would like to explore. But it's funny because this question comes up almost every time, and I think it's changing a little bit now that there's our portfolio sort of getting a little broader. But people 5 years ago when we lectured in schools or whatever, people would ask us, so aren't you? What do you want to do, right? You probably don't want to just do houses for the rest of your lives, and we never looked at it this way, and it always took us sort of by surprise because I think we are looking more at architectural themes we are trying to explore, very selfishly. There are things we are just interested in, material-wise or joinery-wise or just color-wise, and we sort of abuse our clients in the sense that they allow us to work these things that we are interested in into their designs, right? And I think we haven't fully explored or exhausted the list of things we want to do. I think we're trying to experiment with a lot of things on a small scale that at some point we would like to, apply to larger projects. But I think so far that has really not we've never felt there's something missing, And I mean, there are these sort of projects that I think every architect wants to do, like a school or a museum, a gallery, things like that, that we would like to do, but I don't think our life would be, sort of depressing or sad if we never had a chance to do that, as long as we sort of have these other projects where we can do things that are interesting.
But it is a culture of architecture country, right? How many have you done for me lately? Or how many have you done to be able to actually build them on? So I think, what we're doing completely satisfies us, but we're able to just kind of compete against larger corporate firms or even firms that have done 10, 15, 30 churches or museums, and to be able to just kind of step into that arena is really not an inviting one to be able to step into. It's really challenging, I think, to be able to have someone look beyond the practice of just doing something and being able to have 30 of them in your portfolio to invite new faces into something, to be able to maybe re-examine the stereotype of what gets done. Maybe they'll get something that
What's really missing in this country is the total lack of a competition system that opens up those projects to real competition, right? In Europe, and that's changing rapidly over there as well, unfortunately. But when I went to architecture school in Berlin, at that time still, any larger scale project, private or public, would be decided upon through a design competition, and almost every young firm has got their start through winning one of those, and then sort of building a firm on those. You would win as a 25-year-old architect a commission to do a school, right? That's unheard of here. It just doesn't exist unless you have sort of contacts. Like maybe a private school, and the principal or the owner of that private school. But it's a challenging thing for young firms, and I think unless you bring in that expertise that is expected for certain building types into your firm, it's almost impossible to get any of these jobs.
So Brian, talk for Sebastian. Let's ask him.
He's the better looking guy.
Since I'm curious, how big is the firm now, and how do you bring in expertise? Because you have done not only these beautiful projects, but you mentioned one that had very high environmental performance standard. And yet it seems like you remain small, but you're doing larger work.
Yeah, I think it's all. Yeah, it's really all self-didactic. I mean, we are 6 people right now, and it's sort of interesting, right? Because we also realize, and we know people sort of our generation in bigger firms, and it turns out that I think that there's a real struggle everywhere to really have expertise. You just do things a certain way, but a lot of us don't really understand what we are doing, right? We're sort of doing it because that's how things are done, right? Or that's how the CAD catalog tells us how a detail is developed. And I think we try to spend time to educate ourselves. And we have certainly made mistakes over the years where we thought we had a solution, and it turns out that this is not the right solution, or we sort of misunderstood things. But I think we are eager to learn, and we take the time to read and to look for examples and to sort of understand how things are done. That's maybe also why these smaller projects don't bother us, because they are real case studies for us in which we can experiment with, a curtain wall or a rain screen system or a certain window type and learn from that. The mistakes that we make are all on a small scale. They are sort of low risk, low liability, but they allow us to learn and I think acquire knowledge over time, and hopefully it comes in handy at some point for larger projects.
Okay, well, Brian, Sebastian, thank you for sharing your body of work with us. Great lecture. We're proud of you, and thank you for sharing your expertise with our students. Everybody